There lived a poor woodcutter on the edge of a dense forest with his wife and 2 children. The boy was named Hansel and the girl was Gretel. The woodcutter lived in hunger. One day, in that land, there came such high prices that he couldn't even afford to buy bread for food. And so, in the evening, lying in bed, he began to think, and all sorts of thoughts and worries overwhelmed him. He sighed and said to his wife, "What will happen to us now? How are we going to feed our poor children?" And so, in the evening, lying in bed, he began to think, and all sorts of thoughts and worries overwhelmed him. He sighed and said to his wife, "What will happen to us now? How are we going to feed our poor children? We have nothing to eat ourselves." "And you know what?" his wife replied. "Let's take the children into the forest early in the morning, just as it starts to get light. We'll take them to the deepest thicket, light a fire for them, give each of them a piece of bread, and then we'll go to work and leave them alone. They won't find their way home. This way, we'll get rid of them." "No, wife," says the woodcutter. "I can't do that. My heart isn't made of stone. I can't just leave the children in the forest. Wild animals will attack them and tear them apart." "Oh, you simpleton," the wife says. "Otherwise, we'll all 4 of us die of hunger, and all that will be left is to make coffins." And she nagged him until he finally agreed. "But still, I feel sorry for my poor children," said the woodcutter. The children couldn't sleep from hunger and heard everything, what the stepmother said to the father. Gretel burst into bitter tears and said to Hansel, "It looks like we're going to be doomed now." "Quiet down, Gretel," said Hansel. "It looks like we're doomed now." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Don't worry, I'll think of something." And so, when the parents fell asleep, he got up. He put on his jacket, opened the door to the hallway, and quietly slipped outside. At that time, the moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles lying in front of the little house sparkled like heaps of silver coins. Hansel bent down and filled his pocket with them. Then he returned home and said to Hansel, "Cheer up, dear sister. Now sleep peacefully. The Lord will not abandon us." And with these words he lay back down in bed. As soon as it started to get light, even before the sun had risen, the stepmother came and began to wake the children. "Hey, you lazy ones, it's time to get up. Get ready to come with us to the forest for firewood." She gave each of them a piece of bread and said, "Here, this will be your lunch. Just make sure you don't eat it before the right time. Here, this will be your lunch. Don't eat it before the right time. You won't get anything more." Gretel hid the bread in her apron, since Hansel's pocket was full of stones, and they were getting ready to go into the forest together. They walked for a while. Suddenly Hansel stopped, looked back, and gazed at the little house. So he kept looking back and stopping. And his father said to him, "Hansel, why do you keep looking back? Yes, you're falling behind. Don't dawdle, hurry up." "Oh, father, I keep looking at my little white cat. Look, she's sitting on the roof, as if she wants to say goodbye to me." And the stepmother said, "Oh, you fool, that's not your little cat. That's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel wasn't looking at the little cat at all. He was taking shiny stones out of his pocket and throwing them on the path. They entered the thickest part of the forest, and the father said, "Well, children, gather some twigs now, and I'll start a fire so you won't get cold." Hansel and Gretel gathered a whole bunch of twigs and lit a fire when the flames were burning brightly. The stepmother says, "Well, kids, lie down by the fire now and rest well, while we go into the forest to chop some wood. What will we do when we finish the work? We'll come back and take you home." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, each of them ate a piece of bread. They kept hearing the sound of the axe, and thought that their father was somewhere nearby. But it wasn't the sound of an axe. A block of wood tied to a tree was banging against the trunk in the wind. They sat by the fire for a long time, exhausted, their eyes closed, and they slept deeply. They sat by the fire like that for a long time. From exhaustion, their eyes began to close, and they fell into a deep sleep. And when they woke up, it was already a dark night. Gretel started to cry and said, "How are we going to get out of the forest now?" Hansel started to comfort her. "Wait a little, the moon will rise soon, and we'll find our way." When the moon rose, Hansel took his sister by the hand, and he went from stone to stone, and they sparkled like new silver coins, and showed the children the way. They walked all night long, and arrived at their father's hut at dawn. They knocked, and the stepmother opened the door. She saw that it was Hansel and Gretel and said, "What are you two naughty children doing, sleeping so long in the forest?" "We thought you didn't want to come back at all." The father was overjoyed to see the children. He felt heavy-hearted for having left them all alone. And soon hunger and need returned. And the children heard their stepmother talking to their father at night while lying in bed. "We've eaten everything again. There's only half a crust of bread left. It looks like our end is near. We need to get rid of the children. Let's take them deep into the forest so they can't find their way back. We have no other way out." The woodcutter's heart felt heavy, and he thought, "It would be better for me to share my last piece with the children." But their wife didn't want to hear about it. She started to scold and reproach him. And so it was a bad beginning to a bad end. He gave in once, and now he had to agree again. The kids weren't asleep yet and heard the whole conversation. And as soon as the parents fell asleep, Hansel got up again and wanted to leave the house to gather pebbles, just like last time. But the stepmother locked the door, and Hansel couldn't get out of the hut. He started to comfort his sister and said, "Don't cry, Hansel. Sleep peacefully. God will help us somehow." Early in the morning, the stepmother came and woke the children up, giving them a piece of bread, which was even smaller than the first time. On the way to the forest, Hansel was crumbling bread in his pocket, stopping, every now and then, to drop the crumbs on the path. "What are you doing, Hansel? Stopping and looking around all the time," said the father. "Go your own way." "I'm just looking at my dove. Look, he's sitting on the roof of the house. It seems like he's saying goodbye to me," Hansel replied. "You're a fool," said the stepmother. "That's not your dove at all. The morning sun shines on the top of the chimney." And Hansel kept dropping breadcrumbs along the way. So the stepmother led the children deeper into the forest, where they had never been before. They built a big fire again, and the stepmother said, "Kids, sit right here. If you get tired, you can take a little nap, and we'll go into the forest to chop some wood. Kids, sit right here, and if you get tired, you can take a little nap, and we'll go into the forest to chop some wood. And by evening, when we finish our work, we'll come back here and take you home." When noon came, Hansel shared his piece of bread with Gretel, since he had crumbled all his bread along the way. Then they fell asleep, but evening passed, and no one came for the poor children. They woke up in the dark of night, and Hansel began to comfort his sister. "Wait, Hansel, will the moon rise soon? And the breadcrumbs that I scattered along the way will become visible. They will show us the way home." The moon has risen, and the children set off on their journey, but they couldn't find any breadcrumbs. Thousands of birds that fly in the forest and in the fields have pecked them all up. Then Hansel and Gretel said to each other, "We'll find our way somehow," but they didn't find it. They had to walk the whole night and all day, from morning until evening, but they couldn't find their way out of the forest. The children were very hungry, because they hadn't eaten anything except for the berries they picked along the way. They were so tired that they could barely move their legs, and so they lay down under a tree and fell asleep. It was already the third morning since the time they left their father's cottage. They went further. They keep me walking and walking, and the forest grew deeper and darker, and if help didn't come soon, they would have exhausted themselves. It was noon, and they noticed a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a branch. She sang so beautifully. They stopped and listened to her singing. But suddenly the little bird fell silent, and flapping its wings, flew right in front of them, and they followed her and walked until they finally reached the little house where the bird had settled on the roof. They got closer and saw that the little house was made of bread, with a roof made of gingerbread, and all the windows were made of transparent candy. "Let's get started on it," said Hansel. "And what a wonderful treat we will have. I'll take a piece of the roof, and you, Gretel, take the window. It must be very sweet." Hansel climbed up onto the little house and broke off a piece of the roof to taste what it was like. And Gretel approached the window and started to nibble on it. Suddenly, a thin little voice was heard from inside. A thin little voice. Crunch, crunch, all under the window. "Who is gnawing and nibbling at the house?" The children answered, "It's a wonderful guest, the wind from the heavens." And without paying any attention, they continued to nibble at the little house. Hansel, who really liked the roof, tore off a big piece and dropped it down, and Gretel broke off a whole round pane of candy, and sitting by the little house, started to enjoy it. Suddenly, the door opens, and out comes an old woman leaning on a crutch. An old woman. Hansel and Gretel, they were so scared that they dropped the treat from their hands. The old woman shook her head and said, "Oh, dear children, who brought you here? Well, you are most welcome. Come into the little house. Did you bring them? Well, you are most welcome. Come into the little house. You won't be going anywhere." She took both of them by the hands and led them into her little house. She brought them delicious food, milk with pancakes sprinkled with sugar, apples, and nuts. Then she laid out 2 beautiful little beds and covered them with white blankets. Hansel and Gretel lay down and thought that they must have ended up in paradise, but the old woman was only pretending to be so kind. In reality, she was an evil witch who was lurking for children, and she had built the little house out of bread as bait. But the old woman was only pretending to be so kind. But in reality, she was an evil witch who was lurking for children, and she built the little house out of bread as bait. If anyone fell into her hands, she would kill them, then cook and eat them, and it was a celebration for her. Witches always have red eyes and have poor distance vision, but they have a sense of smell like animals, and they can sense the presence of a person. When Hansel and Gretel were walking to her little house, she cackled wickedly and said with a sneer, Here they are, caught at last. Well, now they can't escape from me. Early in the morning, when the children were still sleeping, she got up and looked at how peacefully they were sleeping. Yes, what chubby and rosy cheeks they have, and she mumbled to herself, I'll prepare a delicious dish for myself here. Yes, what chubby and rosy cheeks they have, and she mumbled to herself, Here, I'll prepare a delicious dish for myself. She grabbed Hansel with her bony hand, took him to the shed, and locked him in there behind a barred door. Let him scream as much as he wants. Nothing will help him. Then she went to Gretel, shook her awake, and said, Get up, you lazy girl, and bring me some water. Cook something tasty for your brother. There he sits in Holiva. Let him get nice and fat, and when he gets fat, I'll eat him. Gretel burst into bitter tears. But what to do? She had to obey the evil witch's command. And so the most delicious dishes were prepared for Hansel, and all that was left for Gretel were just the scraps. The old woman would ask Hansel to show his fingers. He'd give her a bone instead. Hansel, stick out your fingers. I want to see if you've gotten fat enough. But Hansel would give her a bone. She mistook it for his fingers. Hansel stayed thin. She couldn't make out what it was, and thought it was Hansel's fingers, wondering why he wasn't getting fat. So 4 weeks went by, but Hansel still remained thin. At this point, the old woman lost all patience and didn't want to wait any longer. At that point, the old woman lost all patience and didn't want to wait any longer. Hey, Hansel, she shouted at the girl. Move it! Hurry up and bring me some water. It doesn't matter whether Hansel is fat or thin. Tomorrow morning I'm going to stab him and cook him. Oh, how the poor sister mourned when she had to carry water, as her tears flowed down her cheeks like streams. Lord, yes, please help us, she exclaimed. It would be better if we were torn apart by wild animals in the forest. Then at least we would die together. Well, there's no point in whining, the old woman shouted. Now nothing will help you. Early in the morning, Gretel had to get up, go outside, hang the pot with water, and start the fire. First, we'll bake some bread, said the old woman. I've already heated the oven and prepared the dough. The old woman said, I've already heated the oven and prepared the dough. She pushed poor Gretel right up to the oven, where a big flame was blazing. Well, get into the oven, said the witch. Yes, look, is it well heated? Is it time to put the bread in? Just as Gretel climbed into the oven, the old woman wanted to close the door to roast her and then eat her. But Gretel figured it out. What is the old woman up to? She says, I don't know how to do this. How am I supposed to squeeze in there? What a silly goose, said the old woman. Look at what a big mouth. I could fit in there too. And she climbed up the pole and stuck her head into the oven. At that moment, Gretel pushed the witch so hard that she ended up right in the oven. Then Gretel covered the oven with an iron door and locked it with a bolt. Oh, how the witch howled in terror! And Gretel ran away, and the cursed witch burned to death in terrible agony. Gretel rushed to Hansel, opened the shed, and shouted, Hansel, we are saved. The old witch is dead. Hansel jumped out of the shed like a bird out of a cage. When they opened the door for her, how happy they were! How they threw themselves into each other's arms! How they jumped for joy! How tightly they kissed! And so, since they had nothing left to fear, they entered the witch's hut, and there were chests everywhere. In the corners there were chests filled with pearls and precious stones. These might be better than our pebbles, he said. Hansel stuffed his pockets full of them. And Gretel says, I want to bring something home too. And she filled her apron to the brim. Well, now let's run, quickly, away from here, said Hansel, because we still need to get out of the witch's forest. So they walked like that for about 2 hours and finally stumbled upon a big lake. We can't get across it, says Hansel. Nowhere to be seen is a path, a bridge, and there's no boat in sight. Hansel replied, And look, there's a white duck swimming. If I ask her, maybe she'll help us get to the other side. And Gretel shouted, Duck, my little duck, come swim to us a bit. No path, no bridge. Take us across, don't leave us. The duck swam over, and Hansel got on it, and he called his sister to sit with him, but Gretel replied, No, it would be too heavy for the duck. Let her take you first, and then me. And that's exactly what the kind duck did. And when they happily crossed to the other side and continued on, the forest became, The duck will have a hard time. Let her take you first, and then me. And that's exactly what the kind duck did. When they crossed to the other side, the forest became familiar. They spotted their father's house and ran joyfully, throwing themselves around his neck. Since leaving them in the forest, their father hadn't been happy, and his wife had passed away. Gretel opened her apron, spilling pearls and precious stones. Since the time their father had left the children in the forest, he hadn't had a moment of joy, and his wife had passed away. Gretel opened her apron, and pearls and precious stones spilled all over the room. And Hansel pulled them out of his pocket by the handfuls. And so the end came to their need and sorrow, and they lived happily ever after, all together.